In September 1944, a transport ship docked at Ellis Island, disgorging 37 German women onto American soil.
Their hands trembled, and their eyes remained vacant, haunted by years of insidious Nazi propaganda. They anticipated American torture chambers, prisoners vanishing into experimental facilities, and savage treatment. Among them was nurse Elisabeth Hoffmann, bracing herself for the realization of her most horrific nightmares. Yet, what she and her compatriots were about to discover would fundamentally challenge every belief the Third Reich had indoctrinated them to hold about their enemy. This wasn't merely a capture. It was the quiet beginning of a profound historical paradox, a deliberate American strategy to dismantle enemy propaganda not with force, but with dignity. These women, a diverse cohort of military nurses, communications officers, and administrative personnel, had been captured amidst the chaotic German retreat from France. Their transatlantic journey was punctuated by hushed prayers and a pervasive dread, fueled by stark warnings like Elisabeth's training officer's pronouncement. The Americans are barbarians, showing no mercy to prisoners, especially women. This narrative of cruelty was a psychological weapon, deeply embedded by their own government. However, the United States, adhering to the 1929 Geneva Convention and housing over 400,000 German posts by war's end, was orchestrating a nuanced approach. Its policy transcended mere containment. It was a systematic effort towards re-education and rehabilitation, a strategy poised to profoundly impact not just individual lives, but the very fabric of post-war reconciliation. As armed guards escorted them from the ship, Elisabeth mentally prepared for the absolute worst. But before we delve into the stunning reality these women encountered at Camp Shanks, a facility hastily converted to accommodate female prisoners in picturesque New Jersey. If you find this compelling exploration of history intriguing, please hit the like button and share your initial thoughts in the comments below. Let's uncover how the illusion of American barbarity began to crumble, not under coercion, but under the unexpected weight of human kindness. As the trucks idled to a halt, Elisabeth's heart pounded against her ribs. This was the moment of truth. Fully armed American soldiers opened the truck's rear, and the women descended on trembling legs. But instead of the expected harsh commands, they heard something utterly unexpected. "Welcome to Camp Shanks. Ladies, we will process you and get you settled as quickly as possible." The American officer spoke in halting German, his tone neither brutal nor menacing, but rather disarmingly professional. Elisabeth and her compatriots exchanged bewildered glances. Where was the promised brutality? The processing building appeared indistinguishable from any other tidy military facility, clean and adorned with an American flag. Elisabeth had anticipated interrogation rooms equipped with blinding spotlights and instruments of torture. Instead, she found herself seated across a table from a middle-aged American woman in a Red Cross uniform, who offered her a cup of coffee and gently inquired about her medical background and experience. "We understand you served as a nurse in the German army," the woman said, "and we want to learn about any injuries or health conditions you may have sustained during your service." Elisabeth stammered her replies, bracing for a trap question, a verbal snare designed to invite punishment. But it never came. The subsequent physical examination further shattered Elisabeth's preconceptions. The soft-spoken, gray-haired American military doctor treated her with the same professional courtesy she had experienced from pre-war German medical staff, before the conflict had stripped all decency from her profession. He meticulously checked her injuries, recorded her medical history, and even prescribed vitamins for the malnutrition she had endured during the chaotic retreat. "You are underweight," he stated matter-of-factly. "We will ensure you receive proper meals to regain your strength." Elisabeth wondered if this was an elaborately orchestrated psychological maneuver designed to lower her guard before the real torment began. Barrack's assignment brought yet another surprise. Elisabeth found herself in a clean, wooden building, furnished with actual beds, individual lockers, and windows that opened to admit fresh air, a far cry from the cramped cells or concrete bunkers she had envisioned. Her bunkmate was Greta Weber, a former communications officer from Bavaria, captured simultaneously. "This must be temporary," Greta whispered as they inspected their new quarters. "They're probably just preparing us for worse conditions later." Both women had heard horrifying stories of American POW camps, of German soldiers worked to death in labor detachments, and of prisoners subjected to medical experiments. They waited for the other shoe to drop. That evening, the prisoners were escorted to the mess hall for their first meal. Elisabeth, her stomach churning with hunger and anxiety, joined the queue with a metal tray, expecting watery gruel or rotten scraps. As the American kitchen staff began serving, Elisabeth was so shocked she nearly dropped her tray. Actual buttered potatoes, fresh-looking vegetables, and bread that was neither moldy nor made of sawdust substitutes. Then came the moment that would haunt her for decades. The kitchen worker placed 2 slices of bacon on her plate. Real bacon, sizzling with fat, its aroma filling the air in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Elisabeth stared at the food, convinced it was a test or a trap. The next morning brought the most startling revelation. Elisabeth awoke to the sound of American guards calling out, "Ladies, breakfast time," within the barracks. As she donned the clean clothes provided by the camp administration, she noticed other prisoners moving freely within designated areas, conversing in hushed tones, without constant surveillance. No one seemed to be monitoring their every move or eavesdropping on their conversations. Upon reaching the mess hall, Elisabeth discovered that the previous night's meal was not an anomaly designed to mislead them. Mary, an American cook, a cheerful woman who had volunteered to serve in the POW camp, served each German woman with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. "Good morning, dear," she said to Elisabeth in broken German, placing bacon alongside scrambled eggs. Elisabeth hadn't seen an egg in months in Germany, such luxuries having either vanished into the black market or been hoarded by Nazi officials. Here, in an enemy prisoner-of-war camp, she was served a breakfast that would be considered a feast in her homeland. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying, overwhelming her with confusion. Elisabeth and the other prisoners sat at wooden tables, listening to the low hum of conversation around them. Greta had been assigned to work in the camp library, helping to organize books available to both American personnel and German prisoners. Another woman, named Ingrid, had been asked about her secretarial skills and offered a position assisting with camp administration. These were not the brutal labor assignments they had anticipated, the back-breaking tasks designed to crush their spirits and bodies. Instead, the Americans seemed genuinely interested in utilizing their skills in a manner that preserved their dignity as human beings. The most unsettling discovery came during her first week, when Elisabeth was summoned to the camp infirmary. She assumed she would be subjected to medical experimentation or coerced into treating American patients in humiliating ways. However, she found herself working alongside American military doctors, tending to fellow German prisoners suffering from various ailments. Lieutenant Sarah Coleman, the American head nurse, treated Elisabeth as a colleague rather than an enemy, soliciting her professional opinion on patient care and genuinely listening to her recommendations with respect. As the days turned into weeks, Elisabeth began to realize that everything the Nazi regime had told her about American brutality was not only false, but deliberately fabricated. The Americans running Camp Shanks operated under strict regulations for the treatment of prisoners, rules that seemed designed to uphold human dignity even in wartime. Prisoners could receive letters from home, were permitted to practice their religion, and could even borrow books from the camp library. Guards were professional, not cruel, and complaints about conditions were actually investigated, not met with punishment. Elisabeth found herself confronting an unsettling truth. As an American prisoner of war, she was being treated better than many civilians were living in wartime Germany. The turning point arrived 3 weeks into her captivity when Elisabeth received her first letter from home. The American postal system had managed to overcome wartime chaos to deliver mail, and she held in her hands a letter from her sister in Berlin. As she read about the incessant bombing, the severe food shortages, and the growing despair of German civilians, Elisabeth realized that the stark contrast between her current circumstances and her family's suffering presented a moral dilemma she could not resolve. She was a prisoner of war, eating better than her sister at home, sleeping in a warm bed, while German cities burned under Allied bombing. This revelation coincided with an unexpected request from Lieutenant Coleman. The American nurse asked Elisabeth if she would be willing to teach basic German language skills to American medical personnel, to help them better communicate with newly arriving German prisoners who might require medical care. The request was just that, a request, not an order, and it came with the assurance that Elisabeth could refuse without any negative repercussions, that her captors would ask for her voluntary assistance, rather than simply demand it. tore another fissure in the foundations of everything she believed about the nature of this war. The language classes began the following week in the camp's recreation room, a space Elisabeth had initially assumed was reserved exclusively for American personnel. She found herself standing before a small group of American soldiers and medical staff, who listened attentively as she explained German pronunciation and basic medical terminology. These were men who had been taught to view her as an enemy, yet they treated her with the courtesy accorded to a respected teacher. Some even took notes, asking thoughtful questions about German culture and Castam's level of curiosity, directed toward an enemy that every propaganda narrative Elisabeth had absorbed. During one such lesson, a young American medic named Johnson shared his own story. He was from a farm in Iowa and confessed that all he had ever known about Germans came from military training films that depicted them as ruthless monsters. Meeting Elisabeth and the other prisoners had forced him to confront the reality that the enemy could also be ordinary people, caught in circumstances beyond their control. This confession presented an uncomfortable mirroring for Elisabeth, as she recognized in his honest admission her own propaganda-shaped prejudices. By the end of October 1944, Elisabeth was grappling with a crisis of conscience that kept her awake at night. The kindness and fundamental humanity displayed by her American captors stood in stark contrast to everything she had witnessed under the Nazi regime. Even before her capture, she recalled German military hospitals where patients were denied treatment for their political beliefs, colleagues who disappeared for expressing doubts about the war, and the systemic dehumanization that had gradually consumed her nation. The Americans were treating her, an enemy prisoner, better than her own government treated its own citizens. The most profound moment of transformation arrived during the first week of November, when Elisabeth witnessed an event that forever altered her understanding of the war. A new group of German posts arrived at Camp Shanks, including several injured soldiers captured during fighting in France. Among them was a young Wehrmacht officer named Klaus Zimmermann, whose left arm had been shredded by shrapnel, and whose face bore severe burns. Elisabeth assumed the Americans would provide minimal medical care, just enough to keep the prisoner alive. However, she was astonished to see American doctors working tirelessly to save Klaus's remaining arm and begin planning reconstructive surgery for his facial injuries. Major Roberts, the American military surgeon, consulted Elisabeth on Klaus's case, asking for her professional opinion on wound care techniques she had learned in German military hospitals. He listened intently to her recommendations and incorporated several of them into the treatment plan. When Klaus regained consciousness, screaming in pain and fear, convinced that the American doctors were torturing him, Elisabeth found herself in a surreal position. She had to convince a fellow German that their captors were in fact helping him to heal, not harm him. This incident forced Elisabeth to confront the ultimate paradox of her situation. She was collaborating with enemy medical personnel to save the life of a German soldier who, mere weeks before, had been fighting these very Americans. The moral complexity of the situation transcended all the simplistic narratives of good versus evil, friend versus foe, that she had been indoctrinated with. During her service, Major Roberts treated Klaus with the same professionalism he would an American soldier, adhering to a medical ethic that transcended national boundaries and political loyalties. The recovery process further illuminated the American approach to prisoner treatment. Klaus was provided with physical therapy to help him adapt to life, with one-arm vocational training to prepare him for civilian work after the war, and even German books to help him cope with the depression stemming from his injuries. The Americans seemed to be planning for the prisoner's eventual return to normal life, not merely confining them until the war ended. Elisabeth realized that this approach reflected a fundamentally different philosophy regarding human dignity and the purpose of wartime incarceration. As autumn gave way to winter, Elisabeth found herself becoming part of an informal community that included both German prisoners and American staff. The lines between captor and captive blurred in a way that would have been unimaginable under Nazi doctrine. American guards shared stories of their loved ones back home. German prisoners taught their guards traditional Christmas carols, and everyone decorated the camp together for the holidays. Elisabeth discovered that some of the American soldiers themselves were descendants of German immigrants, creating connections that transcended the artificial divisions of war. These relationships compelled her to question not only Nazi propaganda about Americans, but also the entire framework of nationalism and ethnic hatred that underpinned the European conflict. Christmas 1944 brought revelations that dismantled any remaining illusions Elisabeth harbored about the nature of her captivity. When she learned that the camp administration was organizing a Christmas celebration that included both prisoners and staff, she initially dismissed it as yet another psychological tactic designed to extract information or cooperation. However, she discovered that Lieutenant Coleman had specifically requested permission to incorporate German Christmas traditions into the celebration, hoping to help the prisoners maintain a connection to their cultural heritage even in captivity. The preparations for Christmas became a collaborative effort, something unthinkable in any German-managed facility Elisabeth had ever seen. American kitchen staff worked alongside German prisoners to prepare traditional holiday foods, sharing ingredients that had become impossible to find in wartime Germany. Elisabeth found herself teaching American women how to make stollen and gingerbread, while simultaneously learning about American holiday traditions. In return, the exchange of recipes evolved into an exchange of family traditions, childhood memories, and future dreams that transcended national borders. On Christmas Eve, Elisabeth sat in the camp's main hall, surrounded by decorated pine trees, with German and English carols echoing around her. The American chaplain had invited a German pastor, himself a prisoner held in a nearby facility, to lead a Christmas service for the German women. As she heard familiar hymns, sung by both her compatriots and American guards, Elisabeth experienced a moment of spiritual clarity that cut through years of ideological indoctrination. The core message of peace and human brotherhood, central to Christmas, had survived the machinery of war and propaganda. Klaus Zimmermann, though still recovering, was permitted to attend the celebration, despite being housed in the nearby male prisoner facility. Elisabeth observed American medical personnel checking on his condition with genuine concern, adjusting his pain medication, and ensuring his comfort throughout the evening. The care they provided extended far beyond military necessity or international legal requirements. It reflected a personal commitment to human well-being that Elisabeth had rarely seen, even among her own people, during peacetime. The evening culminated in an unexpected gesture, one that would be etched into Elisabeth's memory for the rest of her life. Major Roberts approached her with a small, wrapped package, explaining that the medical staff had pooled their funds to purchase Christmas gifts for the German posts. Inside, Elisabeth found a leather-bound diary and a fountain pen, along with a note encouraging her to record her experiences for posterity. The gift represented not merely kindness, but an affirmation of her humanity and intellect, and acknowledgement that her perspective and experiences held value worth preserving. As the winter of 1945 deepened, news from Europe grew increasingly grim for the German prisoners. Reports of Allied advances, the collapse of German lines, and the discovery of concentration camps created a complex emotional atmosphere within Camp Shanks. Elisabeth found herself in an uncomfortable position, simultaneously hoping for American victory and grieving the destruction of her homeland. The cognitive dissonance became almost unbearable as she realized that the very people treating her with such dignity were the forces systematically dismantling the nation she had sworn allegiance to. The discovery of the concentration camps constituted the most difficult period of Elisabeth's captivity. As photographs and testimonies from the liberated camps began to circulate among both American staff and German prisoners, Elisabeth confronted evidence of atrocities that shattered any remaining faith she had in the regime she had served. The Americans did not attempt to weaponize this information as propaganda against the prisoners, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Elisabeth struggled to reconcile the fact that while she experienced unprecedented kindness from her enemy, her own government had been inflicting unimaginable cruelty on innocent civilians. Klaus Zimmermann's reaction to the concentration camp revelations was even more profound than Elisabeth's. The young officer had held on to a belief in the honor of the German army, even after his capture. But the evidence of systemic genocide utterly destroyed his worldview. Elisabeth found herself counseling a compatriot who had lost all sense of national identity and personal purpose. Unexpectedly, the Americans offered psychological support to German prisoners struggling with these revelations, recognizing that confronting the crimes of their government was a necessary part of their eventual healing. During this period, Elisabeth began to write extensively in the diary gifted to her by the American medical staff. She documented not only her experiences as a prisoner but also her gradual understanding of how propaganda had shaped her perceptions of both enemies and allies. Writing became a form of therapy, helping her process the complete overturning of everything she had once believed about morality, patriotism, and human nature. She wrote of the kindness shown by individual Americans, the complexity of judging an entire nation by the actions of its government, and the personal responsibility each person bore for their choices in wartime. Major Roberts, observing Elisabeth's emotional distress, suggested she consider focusing her nursing skills on providing psychological care to her fellow prisoners who were also facing a crisis of faith. This suggestion came with an offer of additional training in psychological first aid, turning her captivity into an opportunity for professional development. Elisabeth realized that the Americans were not merely preserving her dignity as a human being, they were actively preparing her for a productive post-war future. This forward-looking approach contrasted sharply with the punitive treatment she had heard prisoners received and represented a philosophy of rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe concluded, ushering in a new chapter in Elisabeth's captivity. Victory in Europe Day brought complex emotions to Camp Shanks, with American staff celebrating victory while German prisoners confronted the reality of their nation's utter defeat. Elisabeth found herself torn between the relief that the killing had ended and the profound grief for Germany's destruction. The Americans were sensitive to the prisoners' emotional state, organizing discussions about post-war reconstruction rather than victory celebrations, focusing on the future rather than lingering on conquest. Repatriation efforts unfolded slowly, involving careful screening to determine which prisoners were ready to return to a Germany fundamentally transformed by defeat and occupation. Elisabeth volunteered to assist in psychological assessments of prisoners, working alongside American psychiatrists to evaluate their readiness for reintegration into civilian life. This collaboration represented the culmination of her transformation from enemy prisoner to trusted colleague, a status unimaginable in any other penal system she could have conceived. Klaus Zimmermann's case became a testament to the American commitment to prisoner rehabilitation. His physical wounds had healed sufficiently for normal life, but the psychological trauma of confronting Germany's war crimes remained profound. American medical staff recommended extended psychological counseling before repatriation, recognizing that sending him home in his current state would be detrimental to both him and his family. This decision, prioritizing a German prisoner's mental health over administrative convenience, demonstrated the profound American commitment to treating prisoners as human beings rather than political pawns. Elisabeth's own repatriation interview revealed the complete transformation of her worldview during captivity. When asked about her plans for post-war life, she expressed an interest in working for international humanitarian organizations, putting into practice the lessons she had learned about human dignity, transcending national borders. The American interviewer noted her psychological resilience and recommended her for a program that would provide additional medical training before her return to Germany, recognizing her potential as a bridge between former enemies. Elisabeth's final weeks at Camp Shanks were bittersweet, as she prepared to depart from this unexpected sanctuary. Where she had arrived expecting torture and humiliation, she had instead experienced a transformative understanding of humanity and the possibility of upholding moral principles, even in war. The Americans had not only treated her kindly, but had also helped her to become a better person, equipped with skills and a perspective that would serve her well in her post-war life. In August 1945, Elisabeth departed Camp Shanks, marking the end of the most transformative period of her life. As she boarded the transport ship that would carry her back to Germany, she no longer recognized she carried with her the leather diary now filled with observations on kindness, dignity, and the preservation of humanity, even among enemies. The American medical staff provided her with letters of recommendation for her nursing skills and a certificate documenting her additional training in psychological care gifts that would prove invaluable in the arduous work of post-war reconstruction. The ship's manifest included dozens of other German prisoners, returning home with similar stories of unexpected treatment, contradicting everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about American brutality. During the transatlantic voyage, Elisabeth listened to their narratives, realizing that her experience at Camp Shanks was not unique, but reflected a systemic American approach to prisoner treatment that prioritized rehabilitation over retribution. This understanding had profound implications for how post-war Germany could rebuild its relationships with its former adversaries. Klaus Zimmermann made the return journey with Elisabeth. After months of American psychological counseling and care, his psychological trauma had finally healed sufficiently for repatriation. He carried with him his medical records and the prosthesis fitted for him by American technicians, symbols of the care he had received from those he had been trained to hate. Their conversations during the voyage focused on their shared responsibility to bear witness to American decency, counteracting the victim narratives already emerging among defeated Germans who sought to evade responsibility for their government-esque crimes. Upon arrival in Hamburg, Elisabeth confronted the stark reality of Germany's defeat and its devastating totality. The displaced population in destroyed cities and the psychological trauma suffered by her compatriots stood in sharp contrast to the orderly, dignified environment she had left behind at Camp Shanks. She immediately began working with Allied relief organizations, applying the skills she had learned in American captivity to help her people cope with the ravages of war. Her ability to work effectively with former enemies, cultivated during her imprisonment, made her an invaluable liaison between German civilians and Allied authorities. In the decades that followed, Elisabeth dedicated her life to international humanitarian work, drawing constantly upon the unexpected education and human dignity she had received in an American POW camp. She testified at war crimes tribunals, arguing for the possibility of upholding moral standards even in wartime. She served refugee organizations across Europe and eventually established a foundation focused on prisoner rehabilitation and post-conflict reconciliation. Her Camp Shanks diary became the basis for a memoir, challenging simplified wartime narratives of good and evil, and reminding readers that individual choice in how one treats others superseded national loyalties or ideological commitments. Years later, Elisabeth often reflected on the profound irony of her wartime experience. She had entered American captivity expecting the savagery promised by Nazi propaganda, but had instead discovered a system of prisoner treatment that embodied the highest ideals of Western civilization. The bacon on that first breakfast was more than just food. It was a symbol of abundance, generosity, and the fundamental American belief that even enemies deserved basic human dignity. That meal marked the beginning of her education and the possibility of upholding moral principles, even in humanity's darkest hours of conflict. The transformation Elisabeth experienced at Camp Shanks was replicated thousands of times in POW facilities across the United States. During World War II, as German prisoners discovered a moral standard upheld by their captors that transcended anything they had experienced under their own government. This systemic commitment to human dignity, even toward adversaries, represented one of the most remarkable aspects of American conduct during the war, demonstrating that it was possible to fight evil without becoming evil. Elisabeth's story stands as a powerful reminder that the power of propaganda lies in its ability to dehumanize enemies, making cruelty justifiable and kindness seem impossible. The Americans at Camp Shanks chose to see German prisoners first as human beings, and second as enemies. This decision not only changed individual lives, but also facilitated post-war reconciliation between former adversaries. Their choice to offer bacon instead of gruel, medical care instead of punishment, and education instead of indoctrination proved that maintaining moral standards in war is not only possible but essential for building a better peace. Today, as we confront new conflicts and new propaganda designed to dehumanize opponents, Elisabeth's experience at Camp Shanks offers a timeless lesson in the power of individual choice to transcend political divisions and ideological hatred. The American guards, medics, and administrators who chose kindness over cruelty demonstrated that upholding humanity in war is not only morally imperative, but also strategically wise, creating possibilities for reconciliation that revenge can never achieve.